Hi, everyone. Kevin Klinkenberg here. Welcome back to the Messy City podcast. Got my longtime friend Marina Khoury on with me today. I really wanted to have Marina on because I feel like she's probably like, I'm going to flatter you terribly here, but I'm going to say you're probably one of the more important people in the new urbanism that not enough people know. And part of that is, working under the shadows of Andreas and Liz at DPZ. But you and I have known each other for a long time. But you've done an incredible amount of work working on master plans and codes, and I think there's just a whole lot we can talk about today that would be interesting for us to dive into. So, thank you so much for agreeing to join me, and welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very sweet, and I'm delighted to be with you.
Well, it's we don't get to talk to each other near enough these days. We used to see each other much more regularly years ago. And in fact, I was actually trying to think back today. My memory is so bad, Marina. So I'm trying to figure out. I know we met through the CNU, but was perhaps Newtown the first time we actually worked together?
Did we meet at the? I thought the Knight Foundation when you were a fellow there.
Yeah,
Is where we was
yeah.
that before Newtown or after Newtown?
That was before Newtown.
So that's when we met, when you came to Miami.
Yeah.
And then
That's
at the
right.
Newtown charrette was when the first time we actually worked on a project together.
Yeah, that's right.
That was such a fun project, and it's 20 years.
Yeah. Oh my
Exactly
God.
20 years. Tim reminds us of it.
It's ridiculous. It's amazing how fast 20 years can go.
I know.
So, Marina, for those who don't know you, why don't you talk a little bit about your journey as a professional and how you came eventually to work at DPZ doing town planning and coding work?
Well, sure, I can do that. It's a long story, but something most people don't know about me. I'll start with that. Um, we were refugees from Lebanon. We landed in Paris with absolutely nothing, left when the war started, thinking we'd be gone for a few months, never really went back. I was 7 years old at the time. And that really shaped, my husband reminds me, it really shaped who I am in many different ways. But that's how we ended up in Paris. My parents would always remind us that if the war hadn't started, we'd probably still be living in Lebanon, and I'd probably have gotten married at 25 and have 6 kids by now. So my formative years were actually a little bit in the Middle East and in Paris. I went to high school there, and I went to architecture school there. I started architecture school in Paris. It's not what I wanted to do initially. I sort of fell into architecture, but we had a neighbor who I used to love to watch draw, and he was an architect, of course, and I would sit there and just talk to him about it. But I actually wanted to be a diplomat. I wanted to go into international business and go work in other countries and help folks in their own communities and in their own neighborhoods improve their lives. But studying in Paris, the schools were hyper competitive, and it would have meant studying in French, and I really didn't want to do that. Even though I speak French fluently, I always struggle writing it. So I tried to find another career which was quite multidisciplinary, and architecture seemed like a good fit. Mm-hmm. So went to architecture, did the first 3 years there, and then the director of our school one day said to us, "Hey, we're starting an exchange program with the University of Wisconsin. We've got 6 students coming. We know you speak English. Show them around, make them feel welcome." And we did, and they said, "Now you have to come." So we 6 of us went over from Paris to Milwaukee, and we transitioned from an architecture school of 400 people to one of 40,000. Well, a campus, the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee. Right. And I totally fell in love with it, not only with the resources that a school like that provides, but we became friends with the professors, and we really bonded with them in very special ways, maybe because we were exchange students, I don't know. But I decided to transfer there and finish our undergrad, and then immediately they happened to have it was one of the schools where they actually did very reasonable work. It wasn't these, I'll never forget once hearing a lecture by James Sight, when he said to me that his daughter was at school at Pratt, I think, and her first project out of architecture school was to design a treehouse for homosexual leprechauns. And I remember thinking, we didn't do that. We didn't do that.
That sounds so typical.
I know, right? And so they had good projects, and we were doing projects in downtown Milwaukee. And Milwaukee, at the time, John Norquist was mayor, and he was doing great things for the city. I fell in love with the whole Midwest at that time. So, anyways, I had a dual master's in architecture and planning, and did that for 3 years. Graduated in '92, and then there was a mini recession. It's too cold, and I wanted to leave part. And so we literally threw into a hat names of cities we liked, picked Miami. We all moved to Miami. Four of us, four good friends, my twin and I, and then two good other friends. And because we could, I remember Marianne and I, my sister and I, flew to Washington, D.C., took an appointment with the president of the AIA. We said to him, we're moving to Miami. We know absolutely nobody. Who can you introduce us to down there? And he was very nice. He wrote 2 letters to DPZ and to Architectonica. So we called Architectonica, and they said, sure, we'll hire you as interns, but there's no pay back then. And we said, thanks, but no thanks. And DPZ, they were all on a charrette. So when we actually went to tour the office. So that didn't happen. So I spent about 5 years working in 2 very different offices. One where I had to, it was all about business, and he couldn't care less about design. He used to make fun of me when I go to University of Miami and go to lectures, and he really had a business mind. So I stayed there for 2 years, learned to do construction documents. Was mentored by a wonderful Cuban man there, and then I found I met some friends, and they introduced me to another firm which was all about design, and they couldn't care less about business. But I would go to their office, and they had café con leche watercolors on their walls, and they did beautiful work. And I worked there for 2.5 years, learned how not to manage an office, and then my brother-in-law happened to be working at DPZ at the time, and he was going off to grad school, and they were maybe looking for someone with a bit of architecture and planning background. So I went through a very formal interview with Liz, and I was hired. And I thought it would be a 2 to 3 year job, and it's now a quarter of a century later.
Yeah, it's funny how that happens. So, and you're a principal now, is that right? Is that
A partner,
what's your
yeah, partner,
partner?
yeah,
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 okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I very clearly remember studying Seaside in college, and of course I remember going to a lecture by Andres. There was a debate actually between Andres and Peter Eisenman at the University of Miami. This was before I worked there, and just being fascinated by what Andres had to say. I didn't know much about new urbanism until I started working for DPZ. It made sense to me when I thought back on my upbringing, whether whether it was in Paris or it was in Lebanon or Abu Dhabi or wherever we lived. It made perfect sense. We lived out on the streets, but I hadn't really connected the two until I heard Andres speak.
so that's interesting. So even in your uh, time here at University of Wisconsin, you really didn't have much insight into new urbanism then and what was going on, and you so more or less kind of learned that working at DPZ.
I did. When I first started working at DPZ, and I told Andres I had a planning degree, he told me, well, to work here, you're going to have to unlearn everything you've learned. And it was, in college, in hindsight now, it was a lot of policy, it was a lot of statistics, it was a lot of writing, it was a lot of, but because they were incorporated with the architecture school, there was a lot of urban design too. And then there was that, they bridged the gap between the two. And so the planners were integrated with the architects. It still is, as far as I know. And so that helped a bit for sure.
So do you remember back then? So what were the first maybe a couple of projects you worked on at DPZ?
Oh, I remember very clearly. So my first couple of years were in architecture, and there were 2 projects I worked on, one that got built and one that didn't. And the one that didn't was a heartbreak. My very first project from an architectural standpoint was a center for the domestically abused on Miami Beach, for women who were domestically abused. And with Liz, she was the principal, we designed, just a wonderful building, very thoughtfully done. It didn't happen. We took it all the way through CDs, and even contractors, and when it was priced, they realized they didn't have the funds. Even if they were to build it, they wouldn't have had the funds to maintain it. It was as basic as that. So it got shelved, unfortunately. And then I worked on the Biscayne Nature Center, so a nature center on Key Biscayne, and that got built, and that was a lot of fun. So my first few years at DPZ were doing exclusively architecture, and then I decided I kind of wanted to try I would see the planners go off to all these different places. I was like, I kind of want to do that. And so I did some local charrettes. I worked first with Liz initially, and practically only with Liz. And in fact, the design district was my very first charrette in 1997, where the city wanted. I don't know. You remember Miami, so you remember the design
Sure.
district and what it looked like. And there was a very visionary developer, Craig Robbins, who wanted to restore some buildings, wanted to do some adaptive reuse, wanted to have some streets retrofitted, wanted an off ramp off I-95 into the design district, and the city really worked with him, and that sort of kicked off the revitalization of the design district. And he was very good about hiring young, talented, unknown architects at the time, as well as very well-known architects. Like Zaha Hadid redid a building in the
Mm-hmm.
design district, but he hired my sister and her husband when they had just started their firm. He hired Carrie Nadeeb out of Miami to do another, who teach at the University of Miami, to do another building. He hired Roberto and Rosario, who are these wonderful Argentinian artists, to do some sculptures in the design district. So a combination of sort of very tactical stuff, these new architects who are very hungry to do some nice buildings and who design very thoughtful and very creative and very artistic buildings. It began to give the design district a little bit of a flair. And then, of course, in 2011 was when he had then enticed everybody from Bal Harbour to come to the design district, and it became what it is today. A sort of very expensive Gucci, Prada, kind of place, but still with some very, very good urbanism. And,
Yeah.
we pierced passages through the blocks and did some very creative things as well, working with some wonderful firms out of New York and landscape firms as well.
Yeah, I remember you and I talking a lot about the design district, and that's what obviously it had been several years after you started working on it. And it was a pretty incredible transformation in Miami,
Amazing.
because that district itself was really pretty down and out
Yeah.
before that effort. So, I think you and I and others that we're friends with uh, spent most of our time working together on newer communities and new master plan communities. And so, what was the first one you worked on that was just a sort of a greenfield or a new community from scratch?
My first new community was with Andres when we designed Mount Laurel. I was just a designer on the charrette. I wasn't managing it in any way, but I
Mhm.
remember not knowing which side was up because he led his charrette so differently than Liz. It was work, and I remember I was assigned with Bob Gibbs to work on the retail portion of the downtown in Mount Laurel. So that was my very first sort of new town
Okay,
project.
and that's Birmingham. Is that right?
Birmingham, Alabama. Yeah, Mount
Yeah.
Laurel for
Yeah,
EBSCO.
beautiful, absolutely beautiful development. And so you spent more time. Did you spend more time working on the architecture, or sort of going back and forth between architecture and town planning on that?
I was, it was a bit of a blur. Since it was my first year, I did a little bit of everything, but I very clearly remember working with Bob Gibbs on the retail and, laying out what eventually became, well, with multiple iterations, with the town center.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So
But I did
now,
do many plans where, when my first charrette with DPZ, I was doing the building types as we were on
okay,
charrette because that's what I was doing. And then when I began to manage charrette, I sort of got away from that, and I kind of miss it, but I haven't done it in so many years.
yeah. I mean, one of the things that's interesting that I think most people don't realize who haven't worked directly, with DPZ over the years, or just don't know you all very well, is that from the beginning it's been a big part of your formula to invite lots of different architects into the projects, into the design charrettes, and then ultimately into the execution of the projects. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that philosophy, or why that is, and how that's worked over the years.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I would say it's been a mixed bag, but generally it's been a good thing. So we have what we call the DPZ Cloud. This is a collaborators from across the country, like you included, wherever we go to, and the guild was so helpful in helping set that up, of course.
Mhm.
Wherever we went, and we weren't going to stay on and do the architecture, but not only that, because we really believe that you need multiple hands. I mean, DPZ is one of those few firms that believes you need multiple architects designing communities. I think it's what makes
Yeah.
our project sort of stand out. We're always bringing architects with us to help inform the master plan, and our work informs what they do, so that they're developing different building types. And so while we're only a firm of, we fluctuated from 18 at maybe the lowest to, I don't know, 25, 30 at the highest. They've never wanted to,
Mhm.
Liz Andres never wanted to grow the firm much beyond that. With Our reach is global, and the reason our reach is global is because we do find local collaborators. So we have, we've got engineers we work with, civil engineers we work with, we have architects depending on where we are in the country, and we have formed, some great loose partnerships. I mean, they have their own practices, they do very well, but we reach out to them to help us on the projects, and they bring their own flair. And so it's I love that way of working, and it's lightens the load on DPZ. Even though I think sometimes we feel
Yeah.
we're missing out on doing some architecture, and we should probably do a little more of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an incredible tension because back when Brian and I had our firm, it was something we wrestled with,
Yeah,
all the time. There's this real uh, pull whenever you have a client, when you take on a client to do a new community. There's an incredible desire and pull to just go ahead and want to be the person that also does the architecture
yeah,
for it,
yeah,
because you're more in the mix with that client. Maybe you think you care more about it or whatever, and I know we struggled with that all the time. We did bring in collaborators as well, but it's really there are an awful lot of people we know who do these communities and who really just kind of, as Andreas said, it basically becomes like a big architecture project
yeah,
for them.
yeah, yeah. And so sometimes most of the time it's worked out. Other times, those architects have run with the project, and it's just how the wind blows. Sometimes it works and
Yeah,
sometimes it doesn't.
yeah. So, how many do you have a feeling for like how many new communities you've worked on at
Oh
this point?
no, my goodness! I mean, 100 maybe, and very few, very few. Well, no, maybe as a designer, multiple, but off the ground, maybe 10.
Yeah,
But a lot of our work in my office is not so much new communities; it's info work and a lot of coding. We've become
yeah,
we just by virtue, and 50% of our work is maybe doing master codes,
yeah,
and
yeah.
we've done a lot of codes and master plans for downtowns, which are
Right.
quite effective.
Right. So, if you were to think about some of those new communities over the years, are there uh, are there sort of common themes at all that you've seen to either success or failure from the development standpoint? Obviously, we've all worked on a bunch of these that never got off the ground for a variety of reasons, and then there are some that really took off, like Newtown St. Charles, and did incredibly well. Uh, Kentlands obviously, took off, did incredibly well. What have you seen that maybe advice that you might offer to others, other developers or designers, of what's really worked?
Well, so I guess I could speak about Kentland, even though I wasn't involved in. I became town architect when I moved up to the DC office in 2007, but it was pretty much built out. So right now, even though we're still town architects, we're overseeing the renovations people do, the additions people do. There's a couple of tear downs and rebuilds, and it is difficult and a rather ungratifying work to be a town architect, especially if you live in the community. I'm sure Tim Bussey would tell you that. All the town architects who live in their own communities will tell you it's not a very pleasant job, because um, what the developer did for Kentlands is, when it was 75% done, they handed it over to the community. And Kentlands actually has a very sort of formal structure. There's the board of trustees, or the Kentland Citizen Assembly, and then they founded a board called the KHT, or the Kentlands Historic Trust, which is a board made up of 5 residents who are volunteers who review every single visual change application.
Hmm.
And for Kentlands in particular, I was telling them this last week. Actually, there's 2 ways we've been town architects. One is with a very strong design code and a very weak town architect, or a very weak code and a very strong town architect. So Seaside is an example, for example, of a very weak code and a strong town
Mhm.
architect, and they've always had very good town architects. Kentlands, we're a weak town architect, but there's a strong design code, because we make a recommendation to the KHT board, and they vote it up or down. It's their decision. Most of the time, they listen to us, but you get architects on those boards, and they always, oh, I like this, or I don't like that, and we're always having to remind them it's not what you like or dislike; it's really what's written in the code. Um,
Mhm.
so it's and this one in particular is, as I look out the window, is we have fights over the stupidest things, like muntins on windows. Whether that's hard to get to, and this is across our communities. Proper windows is hard to do. You know, Good roofs also, like here you have to use natural materials, so metal, cedar shake. We've just begun to introduce some synthetic materials, which are some are better, some are worse. Slate, we can do slate. So trying to evolve the code to sort of keep up with new materials is certainly a challenge. That's one of the lessons learned, I guess. The other one is, I think what we did, one thing that we got right here, as in Newtown, are the streets. The streets are great. They're narrow. The public realm is wonderful.
Hmm.
The open spaces are terrific, and and Newtown is such a perfect example of that. Newtown St. Charles, because Greg Whitaker wanted to build affordably, and so all the money was sort of put into the public realm. Whether it's the bollards, whether it's the lakes and the canals and their edging, um, it's a real lesson in how you can do architecture affordably. But what
Hmm.
are the challenges in our new projects? It's always the missing middle housing. So we many of our projects did six packs early on. Newtown has them. Our resort
Hmm.
towns have them. We're working with one client right now who wants to do them, but they shouldn't be a challenge, but they are. Um, we're always trying to convince our client to do them for such obvious reasons, 4 packs, 6 packs, whatever. You know, um, it's easier. It can be more incremental. You don't have to worry about parking. You're parking on site. I think they're afraid of how they're going to divvy it up, who's going to take care of them of the common areas, and so it may be a little challenging that way. But I'm amazed at how often they don't get built, even though we put them in all our projects. We do have clients now doing duplexes and triplexes, you know, uh, in beautiful ways. There's one project of Galina's actually in Canada where he's the developer there is doing some really nice work.
Hmm.
Obviously, townhouses are not a problem. None of that's a problem. But the low sort of um, the low scale walk ups. That is the soft spot, and that's such a good way to get affordable housing. And so that's the one building type I don't quite understand why people don't do more of.
Yeah, I think as I've looked at that, we had the same struggle for a long time too, and it almost felt like I've talked about this with our friend John Anderson.
Mm,
It seems like that we have a big part of it is we just don't know who the people are who would build those.
yeah,
And so we have these developer clients who oftentimes are really good at executing single family houses, whether that's a detached house or a townhouse. It's still a fee simple single family house, or they can work with an apartment developer to do a fairly large apartment portion of a project. But they don't really know who the people are that are going to build the
I know.
fourplexes and the sixplexes, and we haven't sort of curated enough of those people that are the kinds of people that you might sell a lot to who would build a sixplex.
Totally
And
agree. That's why the
yeah,
small scale developers, the work they're doing, or the incremental alliance, is so important. To
yeah,
try and nurture this whole new cadre of developers who want to take on these little projects. But um, one thing about Kentlands, I don't want to forget to mention, is it really was designed with this idea of successional growth in mind. So the town center parcels, which are big parking lots, were laid out at the time to be transit ready. So lines are run down the driveways, trees were planted in the driveways. They wouldn't have to be uprooted and replanted. But now 35 years later, they're Kimco, who owns one portion, and then Sol, who owns another. Kimco's coming in with the very big 6-story courtyard buildings, and
hmm,
it's giving the residents a lot of heartache because what you see around the DC area, well, not Metro DC, but actual Washington DC, but certainly in this area are the whatever the blah. Remember that photo with the blah boxes? They all look the same. They're
yeah,
they're they're
no,
hyperactive
uh-huh,
with materials, and this
yeah,
is what we're not too happy about the idea of getting that here. So we're trying to engage the residents, and you've got to pay attention to what's happening in the downtown. And some people, when you've been when a community has been going for so long as Kentlands has, this is the 35th year. The old timers care so much about the vision, and they care so much about what Kentlands represents. But now there's a whole cadre of people that have moved in who just bought it for investment reasons, or because they like the look of it, but they don't understand the history behind it. They get upset when we tell them what the code allows them or doesn't allow them to do. So there is that constant duality that you have to
hmm,
contend with.
yeah. Well, and it seems like in a case like that where you're going to get that injection of big scale in the downtown area, it's a chance for you to really test the code from a design standpoint and see if you can take a building type like that and have it produce something really really good.
Well, if they could just stick to a limited number of materials, it would that would and good windows. We're trying
Yeah.
to give them, what they should be doing, but they, are they going to hold on to the building? Who's financing it? How much do they want to spend? What's the longevity of the materials they're using? All of that is at this stage is unknown. So we'll see.
Yeah.
Well, it is always a challenge, though. It's a challenge and God knows we need more affordable units in this market too,
Mhm.
just to get decent looking housing that is more affordable than not.
Yeah.
Even just trending towards that would be nice.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've always been a little, I'm just amazed at the prices in the DC market. And I have friends going back there from, from high school and everything, and just blown away by what a kind of a crappy run of the mill suburban townhouse in Virginia goes for.
Yeah, in Montgomery County and Arlington County, some of the most progressive counties in the country have all recently redone their comprehensive plan, and they've all tried to do, the Thrive 2050, and they've all tried to integrate missing middle to try to do what a lot of some cities on out west have done, which is allow for single family lots to be developed as duplexes, triplexes, and even to try be a little selective, not just it can be anywhere. Um, but they've had a lot of pushback, you know,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
reasons we understand. But I was very demoralizing to think, gosh, even in these communities, which are very, consider themselves very progressive, it's not an easy
Mhm.
thing to do. So
Right.
I think that's why we like to tackle codes in this
Yeah.
office, the people I work with, because it's just such a great way to try make it easier for those who want to do the right thing or who may want to, slightly densify.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a funny thing. I've often thought if I went back to, my days in architecture school, to imagine that, we would all be working on zoning codes on a regular basis, and that like that would become an area of expertise. I would have, if you told me that as a 19-year-old, I probably want to shoot myself in the head. That no, who would want to do that?
I didn't know what a zoning code was when I graduated architecture school. It would be so different now. But now there's more and more universities. I mean, I see with Liz and Andres teaching, they give their students real projects. I mean, University of Miami is not the only one, of course. There are others that do it, but real projects in real cities, and the students have to look at the zoning, and it is such a valuable lesson.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So, going back to the master planning again, just for a minute, I do want to come back and talk more about codes, especially your experience working in Miami and elsewhere. But I'm curious uh, how critical you have seen the role of the actual developer or town founder, and what qualities you've seen in various projects that have led to success. Just some projects getting built and others not getting built in the whole variety of things you've done.
patience. The whether they own the land outright or not. I mean, or whether they have, who's financing their project and who they're accountable to. That's certainly part of it. We're lucky that we have clients who tend to want to do legacy projects. They're not in for that. They're not going to. I mean, it's Rosemary Beach, Lucadia. They were in and out. They wanted to hold on and then be out within 10 or 15 years, whatever it was. So there are some clients that are that way, but their commitment to the process and their commitment to getting it developed the way it was designed, or somewhat the way it was designed, is hard. It's their own commitment. I think that is really when I think back to the developers we work with, their commitment and their team's commitment, of course. I mean, the firm's commitment to whether a project gets off the ground or not.
Yeah.
That is a big part of it. And of course,
Yeah.
the codes within the communities. Like sometimes we'll write a code like we did in Newtown, Plain Charles, for example, to enable the easy implementation of whatever the master plan is. And sometimes they get adopted right off the bat, and sometimes they get watered down so much that it's impossible to do, and so they lose faith.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes we have developers who are constantly, we're working on a project. I know it sounds crazy, all the way in Tasmania, but
Hmm.
I know where there's two brothers. One is completely committed to doing it one way, and the other one has been doing subdivisions his whole life, and he doesn't understand why he would have to go through the heartache of fighting the city every step of the way to do what all their comprehensive plans say they should be doing. So sometimes it's internal family dynamics too that prevent a project from going as far as it needs to go.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about, our experience even with Newtown, and yet somebody with Greg Whitaker who had an architecture and design background, which I think certainly helped a lot, but also just an incredible relentlessness and attention to detail
Yeah.
to really pursuing a vision that he had in mind. So for him, it wasn't necessarily like it was like you said. It was kind of it was a legacy project in many ways, and it wasn't a commodity project like many other and some of his own projects were.
Yeah, and they don't talk about assets. Like we have some clients who talk about their building types as assets, and you always know
Yeah.
that they're not understanding what this project's about when they start to talk about the community. But it's also about surrounding themselves with the right people. And 20 years ago it was hard. Greg was lucky he had Tim, who's there to really help pay attention. In
Hmm.
and of himself, Greg was helped by the fact that he's an architect, that he really had a good understanding of what he wanted to do. Well, I'll never forget Greg staring at one of the renderings that James Russell had done at the charrette, which was the round lake. And
Hmm.
he after the charrette, he said that rendering changed my life. I think he realized the potential of the lakes and the canals in ways that were that he hadn't thought of before. But surrounding themselves with the right people 20 years ago was difficult. Now it's much, much easier. But our clients are always trying to find the right partners or the right internal folks to have on the team with them. The right GC, the right person who can go and argue with the transportation department and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you a little secret. Something I used to often think about a lot of DPZ projects when I worked on them with you and others was we would work on these, and I always thought, these DPZ projects have just way too much damn public space. It's like I understand the desire for it, but there's like the ratio is just out of control. And and I was talking about this with Arthi Harshaker, that after, and it's obviously as an architect, as an urban designer, you understand the importance of public space. I mean, we all understand it, we get it, and we know the value of it. But it wasn't until I lived in Savannah, which has this unbelievable abundance of public space, that it really started to click for me.
Yeah,
And I think I had my own bias brought to the situation from life in a lot of Midwestern cities where we have public space, we have wonderful parks and everything else, but we don't really have urban public space that much. And uh, so, I mean, I say all that to say it's funny because like now coming around is like, I really appreciate that. And if you go to a project like Newtown, St. Charles, and you see there's an incredible amount of public space, and it's really what makes it work.
yeah.
Um,
So Kentlands has 50% open space, which is hard to believe. That includes the lakes, of course, and the streets. But I'll tell you, so we're doing a lot of work in Saudi Arabia, and they have this ratio that they always want to hit, which is 60% private, 40% public. And we're always pushing them because the 40% public just doesn't get you there, doesn't get you enough open space if you're doing a proper street network and all of that. So I think the sweet spot is somewhere between 40 and 50%, ironically. I
hmm,
haven't gone back to look at all our other projects. It'd be interesting to see. But I can tell you that since COVID, it's probably become even that much more important. And
yeah,
growing up here, being here during COVID and having access to this abundance of open space made the world of a difference because lots are small here. You've got lots of 44-foot lots. We live in a townhouse, so we have a small backyard. It's fine. We're only three, but the open space is your playground back here, and people are going to willingly trade a smaller lot for the ability to have access to all these different playgrounds. So you see these diagrams or this notes that say every resident should be within a 5-minute walk of a playground, but when it actually does exist,
hmm,
it's unbelievable. Like our daughter Lila has grown up with this, and it has given her such a sense of freedom. She learned,
hmm,
she knows every playground by heart. She could bike to them when she was 8 years old. We didn't have to worry about her. Um, seeing kids grow up with that freedom to be in these open spaces and the testimonials we've seen from people during COVID. Like I did not leave Kentland for 3 months once, Kentland Lakelands, once COVID hit. My husband was doing the shopping. I stayed here and didn't it didn't even phase me. We had everything we needed here, and we walked
hmm,
everywhere, and so that
yeah,
that made a big difference. So, a
yeah,
long-winded way of saying it probably has to be over 40%
yeah. I mean, it's
with the
incredible. We
streets.
used to we talked about the playground thing. I remember that going all the way back to like the lexicon, and
Yeah.
the suggestion of how frequent to have a playground, and again, I always thought, well, that's a little much. Um, but then, of course,
Tiny tot lots. Tiny,
yeah,
tiny tot lots.
once you have kids, you totally get it, because
Yeah.
you really don't want to, especially with little kids, you just don't want to have to walk that far
No,
uh, to a play area,
no.
and it really does make an incredible difference to have that variety and that layout and diversity available for
Yeah,
kids.
yeah.
So talk to me a little bit. You've also been on the road a lot the last several years. You mentioned Tasmania and Saudi Arabia. I know you've been working a lot overseas. What's that been like for you, getting back and working internationally, and what are the different types of clients that you're seeing in these places?
Well, so most of our work is here in the US, but yes, we have done a lot of work in the Middle East now. It all started with actually two competitions, but we won both. But one competition led to just project after project after project after project, and in particular in Saudi Arabia. Now, maybe because and it has changed so much since we started working there, which was in 2009. Um, when I was the only woman, I needed to have a special only woman presenting anywhere. I was presenting to a group of men who had probably never had a woman present to them before, and now you
Hmm.
flash forward to what it's like now. You see women presenting; they are fully integrated into the workforce. I mean, the change has been tremendous. Now, my dad worked in Saudi Arabia from 1980 to 1990, so ironically, I would go there as a kid.
Hmm.
I'd spend maybe 4 months of the year there, for Christmas, Easter, and then the
Wow.
summer holidays. And it was way more open than it was when we started working there in 2009. And now it's starting to open up
Huh.
again. Um, there's good and bad to it. So the good is, of course, that they have the resources to want to do projects well, and the scale of the projects are mind bending. Now, we're not working on any of the more what I would deem projects I'm not particularly interested in working in, or projects that are just too out there for us.
You're not
So
working on the line, so.
no, we're not. We're not. We've been asked, but we've said no. Um, and it's not what I want to spend the rest of my career on personally.
Hmm.
I they're doing a lot of new towns and new projects, and that's great and that's wonderful. But there are existing people live in the cities that really need to be retrofitted and fixed, and so that's where we're focusing our efforts.
Hmm.
So we're working on codes, and we're working with them to try help them improve their public realm, because they have they do a lot of things right. They have a very they have a lot of community facilities that are distributed based on the different neighborhoods, and they have a very strong structure of neighborhoods and districts and all that. But their parks are lacking places. They designate the land, but then they don't do it. They don't put in the infrastructure that's necessary for it, or they don't program it, or they don't put trees in. And so it's very tedious work. It's maybe not exciting work. For us, it's exciting because I think it's where we really begin to impact people's lives the most. But they want to be sustainable. They've got this vision 2030, which is highly aspirational. To
Hmm.
want to put three or four of their cities in the top 100 global cities in the world. We don't know if they'll get there, but it can't only be with their new towns. They've got to also work on their existing within their existing communities. And so, yeah, we're working on the code for the city of Riyadh. We're one of many firms doing it. And that's been a challenge, and it's been fun. We have, again, 13, 14 years ago, whenever we started working there, it was impossible to find firms to collaborate with there. Now we have, and they're all young. They're under 40. They are they're eager. They're anxious. They want their cities to be better. They understand what needs to be done. They're learning how to do it themselves well and quickly. So it's been, and this is public sector work. It's been a mixed bag. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's a constant reminder of why you're doing what you're doing, or why you're proposing what you're doing, and they want to do this very quickly. And whether they'll put in the effort that it requires and a big part of that, of course, is the street retrofits. We'll have to see if that happens or not. So
Yeah.
they dream big, that's for sure, but
Interesting.
how it gets applied is a whole different ball game.
So obviously, without getting too deep into the weeds, I'm really curious what the like the legal and development framework is why, like doing a code in a country like Saudi Arabia versus the United States. And, we have a very specific history related to individual property ownership and the rights that come with that. And so our codes reflect that to some degree. What's it like in doing that in a different country?
So a couple of things. First is there's one person who can kill a project at any time, right? So that's always, you always have that in the back of your mind. Number two, property rights, yes, are as important as they are here, and they also have this idea of equality, and you have to treat property owners as sort of the same way, and they give you a land to build your home on and everything. So they do think a lot about property rights. They don't like small lots and big lots because they want everybody to have about the same lot size. But now they're realizing, they're running out of space, so they have to be a little more creative in terms of what they, how they allocate land a little bit. Their processes are much simpler generally, simply because they don't have a city council, they don't have public engagement. They're starting to do that, but it's not citizens coming out and saying, "I'd like to see this," or "I wouldn't like to see that." So their permitting processes are simple, but it's a problem too because they're allowing developers to do things that they really shouldn't be allowing, right? And there's no way to sort of vet it with. I don't think they have. I mean, they have their technical committees within the different municipalities, but it's there's a couple of problems. One is that I like to liken it to a bit of there's a cannibalism going around in the sense that they're all trying to get, like, it's not clear who does what. So there's the vision. There are those who do the visioning, who of course love to do it, and then the municipality is tasked with just implementing it and maintaining it, and so they're not tied to it. They kind of want to do visioning too, right? So there's a lot of grab and pull and shove, and what is one organization one day will evolve into a large organization another day because they've all of a sudden acquired more land, and then it gets taken away from them because someone doesn't like what's being done, and so now then it shrinks again. So that uncertainty is very difficult, and of course they don't tax, and that's a huge part of it. So they don't know where they're going to get their money from. They have a bit of an understanding, but it's not like every property owner is paying taxes on his lot so that the municipality knows we're going to get this much money into our coffers. So they're all dependent on how the money's going to trickle down to them. So it's hard to imagine how to maintain things on a permanent basis. So that part's very different. The nice part is that they have to write the code standards suck, but we're trying to keep it simple for them, so not to overly complicate it with a whole bunch of different layers, and because they do things actually quite easily. And then, of course, the other thing they have is you can have a code, but if someone knows someone in that culture, they're going to be allowed to do what they want to do, kind of thing. So you always have to contend with that. And so we want to create processes in the codes to enable that, but with a certain level of predictability as well.
That's wild.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I never have experienced, working in that scenarios. That's pretty incredible. I do think now you also worked on didn't you also work on the project in Charleston, South Carolina with Andres? So as a complete contrast to all of that experience in Saudi Arabia, Charleston working, and basically you were essentially hired, I think, to try to come up with a new approach to building review and design review in the city of Charleston. Is that fair?
So the mayor reached out to Andres and essentially said to him, "We're known for our beauty, and developers are coming to us, and they are being put through the ringer through this whole design review process, and then what comes out on the other end is just not beautiful. How do we get to elevate beauty in Charleston? No easy task." And so I think what we came up with has been problematic in some ends and successful in others. We suggested changes to their processes. We gave them a matrix under which they should be evaluating projects, the BAR, the Board of Architectural Reviews. So we said split them up into large and small, because large buildings were rather new, right? In Charleston, everybody, they knew how to do small buildings, and it's made up of architects who may have known how to design small buildings, but maybe didn't understand the implications of designing large buildings. And not every firm is Ramsar that designs, that knows how to beautifully scale, take very large buildings and break down the scale to make it look small. And even they've had their challenges. with the BAR. So some architects get offended because they felt that it was a little bit arbitrary what the Board of Architectural Review was telling them. They thought they understood, and then they'd come back, and then they would be told, we would say, we think we did what you told us to do, and then all of a sudden we're like, no, that's not what we want, what we intended. So there's a lot of frustration on many different ends. So we tried to clarify the process, broke up the BAR, and then gave them a matrix under which they can evaluate projects depending on the importance of the street they're on. So more of this, less of that, depending on where you are. And we thought that would be really helpful for the BAR to use. And then a few months later, they reached out to us and said, help us adjust the height in downtown Charleston too. And I remember Jacob Lindsay at the time was the plan director telling us, people will fight tooth and nail for 1 foot, like a 99-foot high building versus 100-foot. You're going to get massive arguments. And we were, of course, trying to change from feet to stories. And we managed to do it in a very short period of time. But because what the developers said to us, I'll never forget developers telling us, like, you can be as prescriptive as you want. Just tell us that if we do X, Y, and Z, we're going to get permitted on the other end, because this uncertainty and this time frame is taking forever to do. And so we put in this little one sentence, which we thought would be good for the BAR, which essentially said, based on exceptional merit, the BAR can give an additional half story. And it has been considered to be extremely problematic, because a developer will come forward and he wants that extra half story, or she wants the extra half story, and the BAR says no. And so now they're challenging the BAR. Who determines what's exceptional or what's, has merit or not. And so they want some want to take that away because they think it's just being applied too liberally. We tend to put that kind of language in all our codes, and sometimes it's been very successful, and sometimes it's been taken advantage of. So I don't know, but that was a really interesting. I learned a lot doing that project on a whole host of levels. Especially, I've had to code a very particular part of how do you code for beauty? That's hard to do.
Yeah.
Other than
incredible.
Hire certain architects.
Yeah.
Which you can't.
And even then, even then it's a challenge. It's never perfect.
Even then it's a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. So then, years ago, you also worked on the Miami 21 project, which was really a landmark form-based coding project. I wonder if you could talk about, what that was. And, it's been, 10, 15 years now since that's been adopted?
Yeah, more than so. Yeah, so we started in 2004, got adopted in 2008. I had just moved here.
Right.
So it's been like 15 years nearly. And I just, not because I worked on it. It is bar none the best code I've ever done that I've worked on. It's so simple. We threw out so many regulations that we have such a hard time convincing cities to do now. And seeing the built results, I think, speaks for itself. It's just, I hadn't been to Miami in a few years since COVID, and I was back there recently, last month or the month before, and I was blown away by, the bike lanes. Now it's become totally unaffordable, but that's not the code's fault. But just buildings meeting the street, the densification around the metro centers. We had dinner one night with Bernardo Brescia, who's one of the heads of Architectonica, and he said to us, "Guess what percentage of people in my office commute to work, and or drive cars to work?" And 10 years ago, I would have said 100%. I was like, 50%? He said, no, 23%. Everybody else either rides their bike, have moved to being close to work, or take the metro. And the metro has enough. From the metro, they have these little freebie buses that can drop people off. That would have been inconceivable. So that will always remain as one of the highlights of my career, I think. And we learned so much through it. And it really took the mayor having the guts to say, throw out the whole thing and start anew. It took the planning director, who was so open to changing what needed to be changed. And we had a war room, and we had so many just sessions arguing through every little bit of the code. But what came out is just, I'm always trying to replicate it as best I can in different places, and it's hard. It's hard to go into cities and tell city council you're going to have less things you can control, and that's a good thing. So you can focus on other matters. I'm amazed at how they don't want to see the process clarified or simplified, because it takes away from their importance, and that's a big problem.
Yeah.
So
much people like to have things they can negotiate. And
There is,
unfortunately,
yeah,
that's a part, something we deal with a lot, and it's a little bit of a downfall of how we've constructed zoning codes in this country, that it's become so much of it's become discretionary, that it then you get people who run for office just so they can negotiate development projects after development
yeah,
projects. Um,
yeah,
so Miami 21 was citywide, is that right?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
citywide.
And so over 15 years, so when you went back, what sort of physical, other than like some of the street changes, what some other physical changes you saw that were most different, or that you think really came out of the code? Was there a lot more sort of small scale infill all over the city, or what have
So
you seen?
yeah, there's I can speak to small scale and large scale. First, the old code was so unpredictable in terms of the form that came out, and because you can go 100 stories in Miami, you can imagine how the unpredictability would have caused tremendous consternation. So for the very large buildings, the way they calculated FAR at the time, you could, if you were on the bay, for example, you could calculate your FAR. Your lot was calculated based on you taking being able to include 80 feet into the water, right? That was
Hmm.
part of your development capacity. So
Wow.
depending on how big your lot size was, the variation was absolutely tremendous. So for the very large buildings, we changed the way the FAR was calculated, and we called it FLR to not confuse, and really began to incentivize parking underground or parking completely lined. So that they wouldn't, that wouldn't be counted as part of their development capacity. So even though everybody shouted it could never be done, now it's being done without even blinking. Everybody's doing it because they have the capacity, and we gave them slightly more capacity than they could do in exchange for their buildings having to behave. So much better courtyards, much better ways in which the buildings address the street. These are the tall buildings. Distance requirements between the towers, limitation of the size of the towers to their orientation, green building standards, over a certain size. All of that was for the large scale projects. For the smaller scale, so it's starting with a single family home, trying to prevent the snout houses and dictating a little bit how you have to manage your parking. In some states you can't do that. In Miami, you can. So we did, lots of duplexes in Miami, but with the entire front yard paved. So requiring that a certain percentage not be paved with, or at least have pervious pavers, was a big part in how they could improve their public frontage. Introducing the density at which townhouses could be built, which didn't exist before. Miami went from
Hmm.
18 units an acre for duplexes to 55 units, and there was nothing in between. So of course, no townhouses were being built. None of that was being done. And all the small sites, like in Little Havana, what we would consider T4, the 2 to 3 story walk-ups or courtyard style buildings, were all non-conforming in some respects, and they couldn't be redeveloped because there wasn't enough to put parking on there. And one thing we didn't get done at the time, we tried to be much more aggressive with parking, and some of the city councilors wanted to have nothing to do with it. And in some respects, I understand it, because transit wasn't what it is today. But after the code was adopted, a few developers came in and really pushed the city to the seed had been planted to say any lot under 10,000 square feet now should be alleviated of parking requirements if it's within a certain distance of transit and all that. And that really helped the redevelopment of some of the smaller lots.
Hmm.
And since then, they've actually tightened the parking again, because it's caused a little bit of a problem. But trying to find that sweet spot of where all of these little tiny lots could be redeveloped, a 50-foot wide lot,
Hmm.
was a bit of a challenge. The
Yeah.
introduction of alleys, which some neighborhoods had alleys, others didn't. ADUs, so, some neighborhoods had, like my neighborhood, which was attached to the design district, had an ADU. And the reason I was able to buy my house, because I was able to rent out the accessory dwelling unit at the time. And some neighborhoods wanted it, others didn't. And at the time, we said, okay, let neighborhoods advocate for it if they wanted. It should be allowed across the board, but it was too difficult to get adopted. So we said, well, let each neighborhood come and apply for it, because every neighborhood has their neighborhood associations. They're actually quite well. That's how Miami works. And
Yeah.
that in hindsight was actually a good thing, because it wasn't no, we don't want them, or yes, we want them everywhere. It really became a little bit project specific
Yeah.
with the ADUs. So those are some of the small things I remember.
Right. And then, so basically, a lot of those small scale projects, the townhouses, the smaller lot things were essentially written as part of the code
Oh
to
yeah,
basically be by right, more or
yeah.
less, that you just, yeah, you have fairly simple standards, and then you can build them.
So
No discretionary reviews.
there were you meet the code by right, you get approved administratively. There was another sentence in there which some developers have taken advantage of, but overall we basically said this is why I think it was such a simple code. In some ways, it was so good. You the city can grant an administrative waiver for anything that has a deviation of less than 10%. So less than 10% parking, administrative waiver. Less than 10% on height, administrative waiver. There was no height and density were the two things you couldn't get an administrative waiver on. But we had waivers, we had exceptions. It was very clear, and the process is still very clear when you are approved administratively and when you have to go through council. And of course, for those who want the special projects, there was a whole special area plan that you have to go through, which is negotiated with the city. We're going to extract certain benefits from you. In exchange, we're going to be flexible and allow you to shift heights around your own project and that sort of stuff. And so the design district, the evolution of the design district was done using that methodology, the special area plan. It also worked beautifully. So, I'm always wanting to go back to that process. Right now, we're working in Orange County in Florida, helping them. We're redoing their zoning code and advising on the comp plan. The good news is the comp plan is place type based, and I think that's kudos to the county for wanting to take that route because it has not been easy. But the code has proven to be very very difficult because there's such legacy language in there. And even yesterday, a whole half-hour discussion about how do you allow people to put parklets and allow dining to extend into the street, which shouldn't be an issue, and it shouldn't require a special event permit and all of that. But they can't. It's hard for them to conceive of how not to do it. I understand they're worried about, who's held liable for what, but it feels torturous, and we just didn't have those challenges. And it's not because Miami's more urban,
Yeah,
But the
right.
good news is now there's enough cities that have adopted codes that you can always point to. Like even they're saying Orlando does this, Orlando does that. We could do it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
It strikes me that, two of the cities that have really boomed a lot in the last decade or so, Miami and Nashville, both had dramatic redos of their codes in about that same era. So you had Miami 21, and then all the work that Rick Bernhardt did in Nashville and Greater Nashville with very similar approach.
actually, I would say it's a different approach because what Rick Bernhardt did is he didn't. It wasn't a one code across the city. It was
right.
planned. It was for the whole city. That's what made it similar, but it was different FBCs, I guess, for different parts of the city. So
Right.
It made it easier in some respects, I would think, but it's probably harder to administer now because there's I don't know how many codes for Nashville. But yeah, Nashville has also boomed and done very well. So I don't know. I wouldn't say one is better than the other. I would love to have this discussion with the city folks to see what they like and what they don't like, because what I do know is that the process has been simplified in Miami. Everybody tells us that. To get a special permit used to take 18 months, and now I think it probably takes half that time.
Yeah.
So, and even the attorneys who are fighting us because, of course, they saw their livelihood go away, found ways to complicate the code and found ways to work within the code as well.
Yeah.
So
well, the attorneys they're always going to find a way.
They're going to find a way. Totally.
Get work. So,
yeah.
So Marina, tell me a little bit about what it's been like working in DPZ, working under the shadow a little bit of Andres and Liz, who are two of our great, mentors and people we look up to in the field. And they obviously get an enormous amount of media attention, and as they should.
As they should, rightly so.
Yeah.
Well,
what's it like working in that atmosphere?
They couldn't be more different. So, I was one of the few people who worked with Liz initially. As I told you initially, I like working with both of them, and they've both been such tremendous mentors. I mean, there's a reason I'm still with DPZ 26 years later. I've just thoroughly enjoyed working with them. Now, I don't work with them enough at all now since I've been up here. I mean, I go years that I haven't done a project with either one of them. And every time I do, the last one was probably the BAR with Andres in Charleston, which was in 2015. And Liz, I literally don't remember. And Miami 21 maybe. So every time I work with them, I'm reminded of their way of thinking. They're constantly challenging the status quo. They're constantly challenging us to think outside of the box, and I'm never bored. I'm never bored listening to them. I'm never bored picking up the phone and saying, "Hey, what do you think about X, Y, or Z?" And they've
Hmm.
just been so, as you know, incredibly generous with their time, not only with us inside the office, but with everybody else. And it always
Yeah.
upsets me tremendously when I don't see that reciprocated towards them. And there are some
Right.
that do, and a few that don't, and it's always unfortunate because they've been so generous with their time that way. Look, I'll never be a Liz or an Andres, and I'm totally fine with that. Um, I'm okay with it. I have I have a family. I have other things that I want to focus my energy on, and so. But I love the work we do, and I love working with them as best I can. I've got good partners too, and we're all very, very different.
Yeah.
And I miss working with them as well. The one thing about being in this little office is that I'm now fully virtual, other than Lou, who comes in a couple of hours a day. But everybody else is remote from my office. Now we do
Hmm.
enough charrettes that I get together with people, and and I'm zooming with some of them, like what feels like 6 hours a day. But I do miss the vibe and the energy of being in Miami. And so when I was recently down in Miami, doing a charrette down there that I hadn't done in, I don't know, 6, 7 years, I was reminded of how much I miss it.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun being in that environment and being with Liz and Andres, more than a few hours. Because at CNU, everybody wants to see them, so I barely have time with them.
Right.
Um, I don't have enough FaceTime with either one of them, and I wish I did, but I don't. Um, but they're very demanding, no doubt about it. Um, most people in the office think Liz is much harder to figure out and Andres is much easier. I think it's the exact opposite. I've always been able to figure Liz out, and every time I pick up the phone, I think, okay, Andres is going to get very upset because I'm going to tell him I'm fighting for this issue, and he'll say, "Let it go." And then other things I think I should let go, he's like, "No, you have to fight for it," and this is why. So I haven't quite figured that part out yet, but they let us do our thing, and they tell us that and Andres in particular, he's really focused on publishing and writing his heterodexia, trying to get that out.
Hmm.
He gave us a brief presentation of it, and I was blown away just by.
Yeah.
I can't wait for that to come out because it needs to be a whole series of lectures on YouTube so that people
Yeah.
can have access to it. It's incredible. I don't understand how his brain works. He's lucky. He has the ability to read something once and retain it. I mean, he's told me this
Yeah.
and retain
Yeah.
it. I don't. I have to reread it and reread it. So, um, it's been a wild, wild ride, but I've loved it. I couldn't
Yeah.
imagine doing anything else.
Well, that's terrific.
Yeah.
I'm curious, coming back to the beginning, uh, have you gotten back to Lebanon as an adult?
Yeah, so when I said we did a competition, so we did a competition in Saudi Arabia in 2009, which it really started our work in Saudi. But I went back to Lebanon in 2001. We were invited to do a competition, and this is a funny story because it landed on Jeff's desk. Jeff Beck at the time was the director, and he picked it up. He was like, "Competition in Lebanon? I don't think so." I was like, "Hang on a sec. If this was Sweden, you'd be going. Dimitri, if this was Greece, you'd be going. I want to do it." And they literally said you have to be in Lebanon in a week. So
Hmm.
there were four of us that went, none of us American. It was Galina, me, Eusebio, and remember Eusebio, a wonderful renderer, and Mo, a Kuwaiti guy at the time. And so we flew to Beirut. And of course, growing up in Paris, lots of Lebanese friends. Most of them haven't gone back, but some have. And in college, one of my best friends was Lebanese. And she also came on the exchange program to Milwaukee, and she moved back there as an architect. And
Hmm.
so there were four firms that were invited: a French firm, a Filipino firm, an American firm, and a Turkish firm. And we were all housed in a hotel and all put in different rooms. And we were assigned a Lebanese architect to each team. And this was to design a site in Mecca, like literally right looking down on the Kaaba, their holy
Hmm.
space. Tremendous topography, huge program. We had to learn, like the prayer rooms and everything else that goes with Middle Eastern architecture that I had no idea about. The first 2 days, all we did was go out and party in Beirut. And our Lebanese architect got really pissed off with us. He's like, "Buckle down, stop working." So we're like, okay. And so the firms got very competitive amongst themselves. And, we had to take appointments to go to the copy room so that nobody could see what everybody else was doing. But we presented our work. And one of the princes from Saudi flew over and he picked us as the winner. And he said, "It looks like you understood our culture and you've lived here your whole life," which was very gratifying to hear. But this was in April 2001.
Hmm.
And the French firm came in second, and he liked their architecture. And he actually said, DPZ and you guys should collaborate." And so we put a proposal together. Ironically, the French firm was the only firm I ever interned with in Paris as an architecture
Wow.
student. So I knew the guy. But then when 9/11 hit, everything came to a grinding halt, and we never went back. And that project never materialized. I still see the site when
Hmm.
when I look, and they really need to. The Mecca has evolved in such different ways, and they don't know what they want to be. Like you need a clear vision to what you want to do. It's not remotely clear, so you see a lot of hodgepodge, and it's a shame because it's their holiest of sites.
Mhm.
But that was the only other time I went to Beirut was in 2011, 2001, and with the work we were doing, some revitalization of the central part of Riyadh, our partner Jacob kept telling us, "Oh, we should go to Beirut. We should go to Beirut." And every time I kept saying, "Yes, I want to go. Yes, I want to go." But next trip, next trip. I had a young kid at home. I always wanted to get back here quickly, and next. And then what happened was that they had the explosion in downtown Beirut a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now, and
Mhm.
since then it's been tough. But I still want to go back. I have a lot of friends there, and I hope to go back one day.
Yeah. Well, you'll have to take the family too. I mean, that
Oh
would be
yeah,
an incredible experience.
oh yeah. My husband will not have me go without him. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think your daughter would probably be blown away
she would. She would.
by that experience.
She would for
Uh,
sure.
I can't remember. Did you say you are teaching her French as well? Is that right?
Um. So my first 2 years, her first 2 years, I only spoke to her in French, and then because Michael doesn't speak French, I sort of switched to English. I really regret it. My younger sister didn't do that. She spoke to her boys in French, and so they're fluent. My older sister, one of her daughters is now studying at the American University of Paris. We've gone full circle. Like we left Paris to come study in the US, and now she grew up at Alice Beach, so of course she wants to urban living. So now she's studying in Paris, and she's totally loving it and learning French. Lila is about to be 12, and she's now getting to the point where she tells me, "Mommy, speak to me in French." So
Oh, cool.
I do speak to her in French, and she replies back in English. She understands much more. She'll say a few words, but my goal this summer is to really get her to speak a little bit, to
Yeah.
speak more,
Well,
at least to try
she's
and to
still
begin.
yeah, she's still young enough that she can learn it
Oh,
and learn
your
it well.
girls are in the French immersion school, right?
Yeah, so our girls are in
Oh,
French immersion, so
that's fantastic.
get Lila brought up to speed, and then at some point we'll get them all together,
That's
and
right. That's
then
right.
they can speak French, and you'll understand, and Jamie and I won't have any idea what they're talking about. So,
We tried to get Lila into the French immersion school here, but we were number 86 on the list, so it wasn't going to happen.
yeah,
Unfortunately,
yeah,
I really regret it though. Oh, that's great. I'm glad. Yeah, I remember Brian's daughters were too.
yeah, absolutely. All three of his daughters did it as
Nice.
well. So,
Lovely.
well, we're running out of time here, Marina. This has been a lot of fun. I do like to ask my guests, since I call this the Messy City podcast, if there is a particular place you think of that you're especially fond of that kind of meets the criteria of a more organic, small scale, maybe less planned city, neighborhood, place that comes to mind that you think about a lot that you particularly enjoy.
Well, I'm going to be very predictable here. I think I'm going to talk about Paris, but Paris because I was just there a couple of weeks ago, and so you're seeing all these 5-minute neighborhoods, 15-minute cities, whatever.
Mhm.
Like our little neighborhood has everything within a 5-minute walk, and the entire time we had the windows open, all I could hear were birds chirping and kids playing, and because we were attached to a playground, and kids laughing in the playground. And I was amazed that this was happening in this, and you can't hear a car. I was amazed that the quiet side of Paris has that, and we are a 15-minute metro ride, 2 metro stops within a 5-minute walk to the heart of Paris, to the gritty parts of Paris, to the touristy parts of Paris, to the artsy, to the bourgeois, to whatever you want to call it. Um, I'm amazed at the different neighborhoods that exist in Paris, and they're very, very strong. And of course, they want to reinforce that. Some are better than others, but the breadth of living you have there is tremendous. And then maybe because I live here, I don't know. I mean, Kentland's growing up, raising a kid here. I miss the urban. I tell people Kentland is as urban as suburbia will get, but it's still suburbia, so it's
Mhm.
definitely not perfect. Um, but for raising a kid between the age of, and we're lucky that we're 20, we're a 40-minute ride to DC. I wish the metro was a little closer, but raising a kid here in that sweet spot between 0 and 15, and I see Lila has way more freedom than any of her other friends who don't live here. that part's pretty good too. We've got a good network of people because we know every one of our neighbors because it's a very convivial place. That part, I like that part. I can tell people, this is why we do what we do. This is why we design the communities we live in, because that sense of community is very much alive. I know it sounds like a cliche, but it's totally true.
No,
When she goes
no,
to college, I'll want to be in a more urban area. But I've realized since COVID, I lived in very large cities my entire life. I never want to live in a large city again. I'll never go
yeah,
back to Miami. I want, it's funny. We do work in a lot of cities that have that 50 to 60,000 people size, 50 to 80, let's say. It's weird. Pensacola, Kirkwood, Missouri. I don't know if you know Kirkwood. We did a downtown plan
for
there.
sure. Uh-huh.
Loved it. A wonderful heritage, wonderful stock of homes, more affordable. Um,
Hmm.
a lot of cities that are around that size. Gaithersburg happens to be a city of around 70,000 people, maybe 60. It's a good size, especially if it's
Yeah,
attached to a larger city. It's kind of where I want to be.
yeah.
10
I
years
mean,
ago, it would
that's
have
how.
been very different.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even when we were in Savannah, Savannah's not a large city. It's about 140,000 people,
Mm,
but it lived much, much larger than that because of the tourism economy and because of SCAD being there. And so there were
yeah.
actually like, metropolitan scale amenities that you had in a much smaller city, but just the size of the place was really wonderful.
Yeah.
So I get that. All right. Well, Marina, thanks so much for doing this. It's been a
I
lot of
loved it.
fun.
It was fun. It's nice
And
chatting with you and catching up.
absolutely. All right. We'll talk again. Take care.
Take care. Bye.